a quiet Sunday in paradise. It began like any other Sunday. The sun rose slowly over the Pacific, casting a golden glow across the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. Sailors laughed, church bells rang, and the air smelled of salt and fresh bread from the mess halls. We are continue like, subscribe, and write a comment. At 7:48 a.m., paradise turned to hell. Black silhouettes appeared on the horizon, not birds, not clouds, but wings of war. 181 Japanese aircraft, flying in formation, engines screaming through the morning sky. Down below, sailors pointed upward, confused. Are those ours? One asked. A heartbeat later, the first torpedo struck. The USS Oklahoma shuddered. Then came Arizona, West Virginia, California. One by one, the pride of the Pacific Fleet was consumed in fire and oil. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Men leapt into burning water to escape the inferno. The sky, once blue, turned black with smoke and screams. In just minutes, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. The date, December 7, 1941, would become a scar carved into history. But Pearl Harbor wasn't just the day America was attacked. It was the day the world changed course. The moment isolation ended. The spark that would ignite a global firestorm. As President Franklin D. Roosevelt would soon declare. A date which will live in infamy. And from that moment on, America would never be the same. The calm before the storm, why the war began. Before the morning of December 7, 1941, before the thunder of bombs and the cries of sailors, the Pacific seemed deceptively peaceful. The sun rose over calm waters, and the American fleet at Pearl Harbor stood proud, a symbol of U.S. naval strength. But beneath that calm surface, tensions had been boiling for years. Japan's ambitions stretched far beyond its islands. After decades of industrial growth, the empire hungered for more land, more resources, more power. It had already invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937, leaving a trail of devastation in its path. The world watched but did nothing decisive. The League of Nations issued condemnations. The United States imposed economic sanctions. But Japan only grew more determined. By 1940, the Japanese military had joined forces with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy under the Tripartite Pact, the Axis powers. Together, they dreamed of dividing the world. Yet Japan's war machine ran on oil, 80% of which came from the United States. When America cut off that supply in mid-1941, Japan faced an impossible choice: retreat from its conquests or seize the resources it needed by force. In secret, Japan's leaders chose war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though opposed to fighting the U.S., designed a daring preemptive strike, one that could cripple the American fleet before it ever fired a shot. "If I am told to fight," Yamamoto warned, "I shall run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have no expectation of success." The world didn't know it yet, but the countdown had begun. Thousands of miles across the Pacific, the quiet harbor at Oahu slept, unaware that within hours, it would awaken to fire, steel, and history. The morning of infamy. Dawn broke over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. It was a Sunday, peaceful, bright, and deceptively calm. Sailors stretched on the decks of their ships. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia floated quietly beneath the golden Hawaiian sun. Church bells were ringing. Breakfast was being served. The island felt like paradise. At 7:48 a.m., paradise turned into hell. Out of the rising sun came a swarm of aircraft, 183 Japanese warplanes in the first wave, roaring low over the Pacific. Their mission: destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters descended with deadly precision. The first bombs struck the airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island, crippling American defenses in seconds. Then came the ships. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. An armor-piercing bomb ignited her forward magazine. A blinding fireball ripped through her hull, shattering steel and men alike. In seconds, over 1,100 sailors were gone. The USS Oklahoma capsized. The California and West Virginia sank slowly beneath the burning water. Smoke rose over the harbor like a storm cloud. Flames turned the sky black. Men dove into oil-slicked waters to escape the inferno. "God help us," one survivor whispered as explosions echoed across the bay. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood in shock. "It can't be real," he muttered, but it was. The second wave came minutes later, finishing what the first began. In just 2 hours, the pride of America's Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Battleships burned. Planes were shredded. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The Japanese pilots radioed one chilling word back to Tokyo. Tora! 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 Tiger, tiger, tiger. The signal that surprise had been achieved. The day of infamy had begun. Chaos, courage, and the inferno. As the bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor, chaos erupted across Oahu. Men who had been sleeping moments before were now fighting for their lives. Some leapt from the decks of burning ships into the sea, water thick with oil and fire. Others scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns, desperate to fight back against an enemy they could barely see. Inside the USS Arizona, sailors trapped below deck pounded on steel walls, their cries muffled by roaring flames. Nearby, the USS West Virginia's crew fought to save their sinking ship, while the Oklahoma rolled over completely, trapping hundreds within. On Ford Island, fuel tanks exploded one after another, sending pillars of smoke thousands of feet into the air. And yet, amid the terror, came moments of heroism. Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill led his men in cutting the mooring lines of the USS Nevada, allowing her to move and draw fire away from other ships. He was killed moments later by a bomb blast, but his sacrifice saved lives. At Hickam Field, pilots tried to take off under fire. Some never left the ground. Others, like Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, managed to get airborne, shooting down Japanese planes in a desperate counterattack. Civilians, too, were caught in the crossfire. Nurses worked through smoke and blood to tend the wounded. Families huddled in their homes as bullets whizzed overhead. The island that had seemed a paradise just hours before had become a nightmare. By mid-morning, the attack had ended, but the devastation was almost beyond belief. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 180 aircraft were lost. Entire crews were gone. Pearl Harbor was in ruins. And across America, a stunned silence hung in the air. A nation in shock. When the smoke finally cleared over Pearl Harbor, the scale of the destruction became brutally clear. The once proud Pacific Fleet lay in ruin, blackened hulks resting in the shallow waters of the harbor. Oil slicks burned on the surface, turning the sea into a mirror of fire and death. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel, blood, and loss. On the decks of the shattered ships, rescue crews worked frantically. Divers searched for survivors trapped in compartments below deck. Some could still be heard tapping, faint, rhythmic, from inside the twisted steel of the Arizona and Oklahoma. But as hours turned into days, those sounds faded, one by one. In total, over 2,400 Americans were dead. Another 1,100 wounded. Battleships that symbolized U.S. power, Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Maryland, were either sunk or damaged. But even amid the wreckage, there was something else rising, a feeling that would soon define an entire generation: resolve. Across America, radio stations broke into programming to deliver the shocking news. Families huddled around their sets in disbelief. Mothers wept. Fathers clenched their fists. Pearl Harbor has been attacked by Japanese aircraft. Those words echoed through homes, schools, and factories, igniting something deep within the American spirit. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was informed within hours. His jaw set, his eyes cold. The message was simple and clear: this means war. And yet, for the moment, the world seemed to stand still, a single breath held between horror and fury. The Japanese had intended to cripple America. But instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, that giant would roar. And history would never forget December 7, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. A date which will live in infamy. Morning broke on December 8, 1941, but it was unlike any morning America had ever seen. The skies were calm, yet the nation trembled with fury. Overnight, the United States had transformed from a divided, cautious country into a nation united by anger and grief. In Washington, D.C., the mood was electric, tense, focused, unyielding. Every corridor of power echoed with the same question: how could this happen? But there was no time for blame, only for action. At exactly 12:30 p.m., President Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the House chamber. The world listened. Millions of Americans, gathered around radios, heard his voice, firm, deliberate, carrying the weight of a wounded but unbroken nation. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The words pierced through grief and disbelief like thunder. Lawmakers and citizens alike erupted in applause, not from joy, but from righteous defiance. Roosevelt's tone was not of sorrow, but of iron determination. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. The vote was nearly unanimous, only one dissenting voice in Congress. The United States of America was now at war. Outside, crowds flooded the streets, waving flags and singing the national anthem. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, some still wearing the soot of factory work, others the clothes of college classrooms. The sleeping giant had truly awoken. And as the world would soon learn, America was not just entering the war. It was coming to end it. The rising tide of war. The declaration of war was only the beginning. Across the Pacific, chaos rippled outward, from the smoldering remains of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of the Philippines and the islands of the South Pacific. Japan moved swiftly, striking like lightning at every Allied stronghold it could reach. Within days, Guam fell. Wake Island was under siege. Hong Kong collapsed by Christmas. And in the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers fought desperately under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, holding back waves of Japanese attacks with dwindling ammunition and fading hope. The world was burning. But in that inferno, something else was being forged: resolve. In factories from Detroit to Los Angeles, America began to transform overnight. Automobile plants retooled to build tanks. Shipyards roared with the sound of steel. Women, millions of them, stepped into jobs once reserved for men, their hands guiding rivets and engines that would soon cross oceans. The symbol of this new America had a name: Rosie the Riveter, strong, determined, unstoppable. Every poster, every radio broadcast, every speech carried the same message. Remember Pearl Harbor. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill smiled grimly. He had prayed for this day, for America's entry into the war. Standing beside Roosevelt, he declared, "We have won the greatest prize of all, the friendship and faith of the United States." Now two giants stood side by side, America and Britain, against the rising Axis tide. The road ahead would be long and blood-soaked. Battles in North Africa, the Pacific, and Europe awaited. But the spirit of December 7th had lit a fire that would not go out. The world had underestimated America's will. Now, that mistake would change history forever. The cost of awakening. The war machine was awake, but the cost of that awakening was staggering. As the United States prepared for full-scale war, families across the nation faced a new kind of battlefield: the home front. Fathers and sons left for Europe and the Pacific. Mothers clutched telegrams with trembling hands, praying they would never see the words, "We regret to inform you." Across every town, gold stars began to appear in windows, silent symbols of sacrifice. The Japanese-American internment marked one of the darkest chapters in this awakening. In the name of national security, over 120,000 innocent people, most of them U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and sent to desolate camps surrounded by barbed wire. Fear had replaced trust. Years later, survivors would still remember the sting of betrayal. "We were Americans," they would say, "but America forgot us." Meanwhile, American soldiers were learning what global war truly meant. The fighting in the Pacific was unlike anything they had trained for: brutal jungle warfare, kamikaze attacks, disease, and starvation. In the cold Atlantic, German U-boats prowled like wolves, sinking supply ships faster than they could be built. Yet through every hardship, something remarkable grew: unity. People rationed, recycled, and worked long hours not for wealth, but for victory. Propaganda posters reminded everyone, "When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler." It was a war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with faith, resilience, and collective determination. The cost of awakening was high. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the world began to believe, maybe, just maybe, the tide could turn. The sleeping giant was not only awake, it was learning how to fight back. The tide turns. By mid-1942, the echo of Pearl Harbor still haunted America. But now, that echo was met with defiance. The United States was done mourning. It was time to strike back. The first real taste of revenge came in April 1942, when Colonel James Doolittle led a daring raid on Tokyo itself. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the USS Hornet, something experts said was impossible. They barely had enough fuel to make it home, and most never did. But for the American people, those bombs meant more than destruction. They meant hope. Japan could be hit. The giant had landed its first punch. Then came Midway, June 1942. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of their navy, lay burning in the Pacific by the battle's end. A stunned Admiral Yamamoto, the very man who had planned Pearl Harbor, reportedly murmured, "The tide of war has turned against us." From that moment, Japan would never recover its former strength. But the road to victory was still long, and steeped in blood. Every island became a fortress. Every inch of ground had to be earned with lives. At home, American industry roared. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Women filled factories, building tanks, planes, and ships faster than the enemy could destroy them. The same people who had once known only peace were now fueling the largest war machine in history. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor were finally finding peace, not through vengeance, but through relentless resolve. And across the oceans, the Axis powers began to feel it. A force too vast to crush, too determined to break, and too united to stop. The tide had turned, and the world was watching. The lesson of Pearl Harbor. By 1945, the guns of war had fallen silent. The empire that had struck without warning at Pearl Harbor was in ruins. Japan had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The world stood in awe of what America, and its allies, had endured, and what they had become. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose not vengeance, but vigilance. A nation once unprepared for war had transformed into a global power. Its soldiers had fought across continents, its ships had sailed every ocean, and its flag had been raised over shattered cities from Berlin to Tokyo. Yet, even in victory, the memory of that quiet Sunday morning lingered. For the men who had been there, sailors who pulled burning comrades from the sea, nurses who worked until their hands bled, and survivors who never forgot the sound of the bombs, peace was not celebration. It was reflection. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's words echoed through history. A date which will live in infamy. But it was not only a day of tragedy. It became the day America awoke, a lesson written in fire and courage. The ruins of Pearl Harbor were rebuilt, but not erased. The USS Arizona still lies beneath the waves, her crew entombed within, a silent monument to the cost of complacency, and the price of freedom. Every generation since has looked back on that day and asked the same question. Could it happen again? The answer depends not on weapons or armies, but on memory. For the greatest defense of peace is not power. It is remembrance. Thanks for watching. Pearl Harbor was not the end of innocence. It was the beginning of resolve. And that resolve changed the world forever.